My name is Elena Marsh. I was 29 years old and I was standing in a wedding dress that cost 4 months of my salary, watching my parents get moved from the front row like furniture nobody had asked for. It happened fast. A banquet captain, in a black vest, walked up to my mother, leaned down, and said very politely that the Whitfield family needed the front 2 rows for close family only. My mother is quiet. She doesn't make scenes. She picked up her purse, took my father's arm, and let herself be walked to a folding chair near the kitchen doors, behind a pillar, where the photographer's assistant kept bumping her with a light stand. My new mother-in-law, Patricia Whitfield, watched the whole thing from her seat in the front row without blinking. When I caught her eye, she smiled the way you smile at a waiter who brought the wrong wine and said, "Don't make this bigger than it is, Elena. Today is about family." She did not mean my family. What she didn't know was that 3 days earlier, a manila envelope had arrived at my office with a return address I didn't recognize, and inside it was something that would make her folding chair speech the last comfortable moment she had for a very long time. I'm going to tell you exactly what was in that envelope, what I did with it during my own wedding reception, and why my husband's family left that ballroom with a lot less than they walked in with. But first, tell me what time it is where you're watching this and what city you're in, because I want to know how far this story is traveling tonight. And if you've ever had someone try to take over the one day that was supposed to be yours, hit subscribe before we go any further, because you're going to want to see how this one ends. I should tell you a little about how we got to that ballroom, because none of this started at the wedding. It started when I was 11 years old. My father ran a small hardware store in our town. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid for our house and my school shoes, and every single Christmas, it paid for whatever my Aunt Carol's kids wanted, because my grandmother believed that the ones who have, give. I remember standing in the store on a Saturday afternoon, watching my father hand my cousin Danny $200 in cash for a bike, and then, later that week, telling me we couldn't afford new cleats for soccer season. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. My family had a pattern, and I was raised inside it. The quiet ones absorb the cost, so the loud ones don't have to feel anything. The second scene is smaller, but it stayed with me longer. I was 16, and my mother had saved for a year to take. The 2 of us on a small trip, just her and me, to the coast. 2 days before we left, my grandmother called and said Aunt Carol's family was going through something and needed the trip money instead. My mother gave it to her. She told me we'd go another time. We never went. I remember sitting on my bed that night thinking, this is just what we do. We give the room, we give the chair, we give the trip, and we say it's fine because saying it's fine is easier than watching someone we love get uncomfortable. There's a third scene I need to tell you, because it's the one that explains why I stayed quiet for as long as I did once I was an adult. I was 22, fresh out of college, and my parents drove 6 hours to help me move into my first apartment. My father spent the whole weekend fixing a leaking sink and hanging shelves for free, refusing to let me pay him for the parts. That same weekend, my grandmother called my mother crying about Aunt Carol's youngest needing braces and asked if my parents could help out just this once. My mother, standing in my half-unpacked kitchen, said yes before she'd even hung up the phone. I remember asking her quietly why she never said no. She looked at me and said, "Because if I say no, I have to sit with everyone being upset with me. It's easier to just give it." I didn't understand, at 22, that she had just described exactly how people learn to be taken advantage of. I understand it now. By the time I met Daniel Whitfield, I didn't even notice I was doing it anymore. I gave up my aisle seat on our first flight together because his mother wanted to sit next to him. I let his sister plan our engagement dinner at a restaurant my parents couldn't easily afford because it's Patricia's favorite place. When Patricia suggested gently at first that my parents might want to chip in for the engagement party since everyone contributes to these things, I quietly transferred $300 to her account without telling my mother because I didn't want my mother to feel the way I'd watched her feel outside my grandmother's kitchen for 20 years. I told myself it was generosity. It was actually a reflex, one I'd had since I was 11, watching $200 leave a cash register that couldn't afford it. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly, almost like a chart. Every time my family gave something, it was framed as love. Every time the Whitfields took something, it was framed as fairness or tradition or simply how things are done. Nobody ever called it what it was. which is one family quietly subsidizing another family's comfort, decade after decade, meal after meal, gift after gift, and calling the arrangement generosity so nobody had to call it what it actually was. The moment. Everything changed happened 4 months before the wedding, in my own kitchen, over a spreadsheet. Daniel and I had agreed, on paper, in an email thread with the venue, that both families would split the deposit and the final balance 60-40, since the Whitfields had insisted on upgrading the venue to their preferred ballroom, a difference of almost $11,000. My parents had already wired their portion. I had the confirmation from the bank. 2 weeks later, the venue coordinator called me directly, confused because the Whitfields' promised 60% had never arrived, and the balance was now overdue in my name. When I called Patricia to ask about it, she actually laughed, and said, "Oh, we assumed your father would just cover that since he seems to enjoy providing for people." Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Besides, it's not like we're asking for much. We're the ones giving you a real wedding." I sat there with the phone against my ear in my own kitchen and felt something in me go very still and very cold. Not angry. Still. The kind of still you feel right before you stop absorbing something and start documenting it instead. That was the night I opened a folder on my laptop and named it simply Wedding. I didn't know yet everything that would go inside it. I just knew I was done being the one who quietly closes the gap. Here is what I want you to understand about the next 4 months. I never raised my voice. I never confronted anyone at a family dinner. I never sent an angry text. What I did instead was slower and colder and far more effective. I started saving everything. Every email from the venue, every text from Patricia, screenshots, timestamps, all of it, backed up in 3 places. When Patricia texted, "Don't worry about the balance, your father can handle it," I saved that message with the date and time. When my sister-in-law Renee texted the family group chat suggesting they rearrange the seating chart a little so the real family sat up front, I took a screenshot before anyone could delete it. I want to be clear about something because this matters. I wasn't collecting evidence to destroy anyone. I was collecting it because I had learned over almost 2 decades that when you don't have proof, people get to rewrite what happened. My mother had given up a coastal trip because there was no record of the promise being broken, just a soft, deniable phone call. I was done with soft and deniable. I kept a simple system, nothing complicated. Every email related to the wedding went into a labeled folder with a corresponding date stamp. Every text thread got backed up to a private cloud drive, the kind that timestamps automatically and can't be edited after the fact. I printed the venue contract and highlighted the 60-40 split clause in yellow, then photographed the highlighted page and stored the photo alongside the digital copy, so there would always be 2 independent versions that matched. I kept a small notebook, actual paper, in my nightstand drawer, where I wrote down verbal conversations within an hour of having them, word for word as best I could remember, with the date and time at the top of the page. I did this quietly. At night, usually after Daniel had fallen asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside me. I remember one night in particular, about 6 weeks before the wedding, when Patricia called to check in about the guest list and mentioned almost in passing that she'd told her sister my parents weren't in a position to help much financially, given everything. I hadn't said anything like that to anyone. My parents had, in fact, paid every dollar they'd agreed to on time. I wrote that call down in the notebook before I even took my coat off, my hands still cold from the walk from the car. That single sentence, given everything, told me Patricia wasn't just taking advantage of a gap. She was actively constructing a story where my family was the reason for it. 3 weeks before the wedding, the manila envelope arrived at my office. Inside was a letter from an estate attorney named Thomas Okafor, along with copies of financial documents belonging to my new father-in-law's small construction company, the Whitfield Group. The sender was my husband's uncle, a man named Harold, who had been quietly pushed out of the family business 2 years earlier after a disagreement with Patricia over how things were run. Harold had kept records. He had kept them for 2 years, waiting, he said in his cover letter, for someone in this family who might actually do something honest with them. The documents showed a pattern. Patricia and her husband Gerald had been moving money out of the company's operating account into a personal account under Patricia's maiden name, using it to fund things like the wedding venue upgrade they never paid for, a car for Renee, and a down payment on a lake house that the rest of the family didn't know existed. Employees hadn't been paid overtime correctly for over a year. There was a wire transfer, dated the same week Patricia told me my father should cover the balance, for $9,400, moved into the same personal account, labeled in the memo line as Wedding Fund, Reserve. They had the money. They had always had the money. They had simply decided it belonged to them, and that my family's money belonged to everyone. I sat at my kitchen table that night and read every page twice. There was a spreadsheet, printed and slightly yellowed at the edges, showing payroll. Disbursements next to a second column labeled simply PW transfers, Patricia's initials dated across nearly 3 years. There were photocopies of 2 wire confirmations for the lake house, one for the down payment and one for a dock repair, both routed through an account that didn't appear anywhere on the company's official books. There was a handwritten note, in Harold's blocky engineer's handwriting, that said, "I tried to raise this with Gerald in 2022. He told me to let it go, for the sake of the family. I let it go for 2 years. I'm done letting it go." Reading that line, I understood Harold and I were doing the exact same thing, just years apart. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like the only person in this family who had finally run out of patience for quiet arrangements. I didn't confront Patricia with the envelope. I didn't call Daniel screaming. I did something much quieter. I called Harold and I asked him one question. "Do you want this to come out, or do you just want me to know?" He said, "I want the people who worked for that company for years and got shorted to finally get what they're owed. I want Patricia to stop pretending she built something she stole from her own husband's payroll. But I'm not going to be the one to do it. That's not my wedding." So I made a decision. I wasn't going to scream at a wedding. I was going to let the truth introduce itself, calmly, with dates attached. I hired my own wedding day coordinator, separate from the Whitfield family's preferred planner, a woman named Priya who worked directly for the venue and answered only to whoever had actually paid the deposit, which, thanks to the bank records, was legally me and my father. I quietly confirmed with the venue, in writing, that seating arrangements, microphone access, and the reception timeline were under the paying client's authority, which was my name on the contract, not Patricia's. I also did one more thing. Forwarded Harold's documents to a family law attorney, not for the marriage, but to protect my parents from being held financially responsible for a balance the Whitfields had always been able to pay and simply chose not to. The attorney sent a formal notice to the venue and to the Whitfield Group's business account, CCing Gerald directly, stating that any outstanding balance tied to my family's name needed to be resolved by the responsible party according to the original written agreement, with documentation attached. It was polite, it was professional, it had dates, amounts, and account numbers. 2 days before the wedding, Patricia called me, and for the first time in 4 months, she didn't sound entitled. She sounded careful. I heard from Gerald's assistant that some kind of letter went to the business account, she said. "Do you know anything about that?" I said, "I know we agreed on 60-40, and only 40 arrived. I know my father wired his portion on time. I know the venue called me directly because the balance is in my name. That's all I know, Patricia." I said it exactly like that. Calm. Flat. No accusation, just facts. The way you'd read someone their own receipt. She didn't bring it up again. She thought it was handled. She had no idea Harold's envelope existed, or that the same attorney now had a full financial picture of the last 2 years, sitting quietly in a folder, waiting. The morning of the wedding, my mother helped me into my dress in a small side room at the venue, and I watched her hands shake slightly as she did up the last few buttons. She said, "I don't want any trouble today, Elena. Please, just let it be a nice day." And I understood in that moment exactly what she was asking for, because it was the same thing she had asked for her whole life. Don't make waves, absorb. The gap, keep the peace. I held her hands and said, "Mom, I'm not going to cause any trouble today. I'm just not going to let anyone move you again." She didn't fully understand what I meant. She would by the end of the night. The ceremony itself was beautiful, and I want to be honest with you, for about 40 minutes, I actually let myself enjoy it. Daniel cried when I walked down the aisle. My father squeezed my hand before he gave me away and whispered, "You look like your mother did on our wedding day." For a little while, none of the spreadsheets and envelopes and bank statements mattered. I just got married to a man I loved, in front of people I loved, and it was good. I remember small, specific things from that stretch of the afternoon, the kind of details you only notice when you're actually present in a moment instead of managing it. The light coming through the tall windows behind the altar was the color of weak tea. My bouquet smelled like eucalyptus and something faintly sweet I couldn't name. Daniel's hands were shaking slightly when he slid the ring onto my finger, and he laughed at himself for it. A small, embarrassed laugh that made the whole room laugh with him. For those 40 minutes, I wasn't thinking about wire transfers or forged signatures. I was just a woman getting married. I want you to know that, because everything that came after wasn't born out of bitterness. It came out of love for two people who had spent their whole lives giving quietly, and who deserved, for one single evening, to not be the ones absorbing the gap. Then we got to the reception, and Patricia moved my parents to a folding table by the kitchen doors. And the day I had planned for became the day I actually needed to fight for. I want to walk you through exactly what happened next, because the details matter. The seating chart I had approved with the venue had my parents at the second table, close to the head table, near the dance floor, with my aunt and my childhood best friend. When we walked into the reception, that chart had been changed. A new one, printed on Whitfield family stationery, had my parents pushed to a table near the kitchen, and the Whitfield extended family, cousins, and second cousins I'd met exactly twice, filling the seats that should have belonged to my side. When I found Priya, my coordinator, she looked stressed and said Patricia had told the venue staff that morning that the bride made a mistake with the chart and this was the corrected version, and had even forged a signature that looked like mine at the bottom of the printed page approving the change. I looked at it. It wasn't my handwriting, it wasn't even close. But it didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be believed by staff who were trying to keep a wedding running smoothly and didn't have time to interrogate a signature. This is the moment where, 4 months earlier, old Elena would have swallowed it, smiled, and quietly asked her parents to sit wherever there was room. But I wasn't that Elena anymore. I asked Priya to pull up the original signed chart on her tablet, the one time-stamped from 3 weeks earlier, with my actual approval and the venue's confirmation email attached. I asked her to keep both versions open, and to hold on to that forged signature. Then I asked her to move my parents back to their assigned table, exactly as originally planned, and I asked security, quietly, not to allow anyone to change the chart again without going through me directly, since I was the primary contract holder. My parents were moved back within 15 minutes. Patricia didn't find out until she walked in and saw them sitting exactly where they were supposed to be. The toast started around 8. Daniel's best man went first, easy and funny, the kind of toast that gets everyone laughing. Then Patricia stood up, tapped her glass, and took the microphone before anyone had actually handed it to her. She talked. For almost 6 minutes. She talked about welcoming Elena into a family that knows what real generosity looks like. She talked about how she and Gerald had made sure this day was everything it needed to be, no expense spared. She said, and I remember this exactly because I wrote it down later that night while it was still fresh. Some families give what they can. Our family gives what's needed. That's the difference between showing up and actually providing. She was looking directly at my parents' table when she said it. The room laughed a little, uncomfortably, the way people laugh when they're not sure if something was a joke or an insult. My mother stared at her wine glass. My father's jaw tightened. Daniel, to his credit, looked uncomfortable too, but he didn't say anything because he still didn't know what I knew. When Patricia sat down, I stood up. I want to tell you what that felt like because it wasn't rage. It was the calmest I had felt in 4 months. I walked to the front of the room, in my wedding dress, and I asked the band to hand me the microphone, and Priya, standing near the sound system, gave me a small nod because she already knew what documents were sitting in a folder on my phone, ready if I needed them. I didn't need all of them. I only needed a few sentences. I said, "Thank you, Patricia, for that toast. I actually want to add something since we're talking about generosity and what real family provides." The room went quiet. That specific kind of quiet where 200 people all lean forward 2 inches without meaning to. I said, 3 days before this wedding, I received documents showing that the Whitfield family has had more than enough money, this whole time, to cover the venue balance they agreed to in writing. Not only did they have it, part of that money was labeled in an actual wire transfer as a wedding fund. My father wired his portion on time. The venue called me directly because the other half never arrived, and I was told, and I'm quoting, Exactly, that my father could handle it since he seems to enjoy providing for people. I let that sit for 1 second. Then I said, so when Patricia says some families give what they can, and this family gives what's needed, I want to clarify. My family gave everything they agreed to give on time, in full. This family had it and chose not to, and then tried to shame my parents for a gap they created. My parents were also moved this evening from the seats I personally approved to a table by the kitchen, using a seating chart with a signature that isn't mine. Patricia's face had gone completely white. Gerald was staring at his plate. I could see Renee reaching for her phone, I said calmly. I'm not telling you this to ruin a wedding. I already had one. It was this afternoon and it was beautiful. I'm telling you this because my parents have spent their whole lives quietly covering gaps other people created, and tonight that stops. My parents will be sitting at the table I chose for them for the rest of this night, and nobody is going to move them again. I put the microphone down. I didn't wait for applause, and I didn't get much at first, just a long, stunned silence, the kind that feels louder than noise. Then something happened that I did not plan, and could not have planned. Harold stood up from a table near the back. I hadn't even realized he'd been invited quietly by Daniel, who didn't know the history with the documents. Harold walked to the front, and he asked Priya for the microphone, and he said, since we're clarifying things tonight, I'll add one more piece. I used to run finance for the Whitfield Group. I have 2 years of records showing money moved out of that company's payroll account into personal accounts, the same accounts that funded tonight's flowers and the lake house nobody in this family knew about until now. Employees who worked overtime for the last year are owed real money. That's not a rumor. That's a paper trail, and it's already with an attorney. You could hear forks stop moving. Renee's phone was already out, and within minutes, the extended family group chat, the one Renee had used months earlier to suggest rearranging seating for real family, turned into something else entirely. I saw it later because someone screenshotted it and sent it to me. Cousins who had spent all afternoon being seated in my parents' place were now asking Patricia, in that same group chat, if it was true about the lake house. An aunt wrote, "Is this why you told me you couldn't help with Dad's medical bills last year?" Nobody was performing for an audience anymore. The audience had turned into the jury. Gerald stood up from the head table, not to defend Patricia, but to quietly ask Harold, in a low voice, that the microphone still caught because Harold hadn't let go of it yet, whether the documents included the transfer for the lake house down payment specifically, because he said he'd never approved that one either. That single sentence told the whole room that even Gerald hadn't fully known what Patricia had been doing with the company's money. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. I went back to my seat, next to my new husband, who looked at me with an expression I'll remember for the rest of my life, somewhere between shock and something that looked a lot like relief, like he'd been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to finally say the thing out loud. The rest of the reception happened in a strange, hushed version of normal. The band kept playing. Some people danced, but Patricia and Gerald left before the cake was cut, walking out through a side door instead of the main one, and nobody stopped them. I want to walk you through what happened in the weeks after, because the reception was only the beginning. 2 days after the wedding, the venue's finance office confirmed in writing that the balance had officially been resolved, paid in full directly from a Whitfield Group account, under what their letter carefully called an administrative correction. I framed nothing about that letter, but I did save it, the same way I'd saved everything else. Harold's documents did exactly what he said they would. He turned them over to the company's remaining board members, not the family, the actual business board, since the Whitfield Group had non-family investors from an expansion 5 years earlier. An internal audit was opened within the month. I later learned, through Daniel, who by then had stopped defending his mother and started asking his own questions, that the audit confirmed nearly $200,000 in misallocated funds over 3 years, and that Patricia was removed from her position as office director, a title that had given her signing authority she was never supposed to have long-term. Gerald kept his role, but only after agreeing to independent oversight of every account for the next 5 years, a condition set by the investors, not by our family. The unpaid overtime Harold mentioned turned out to be real too. 14 employees received back pay, some of it going back over a year, once the audit forced the company to reconcile the numbers. I think about that sometimes, more than I think about Patricia's humiliation. 14 people got money they were owed because one uncle kept records for 2 years and waited for the right moment to hand them to someone who would actually use them. The social fallout was slower, but just as real. Renee's group chat screenshots kept circulating quietly through the extended family for weeks. An aunt who had been told for years that there wasn't enough money to help with her father's medical bills, the same grandfather who had funded my cousin's bike money and skipped my cleats years before that, found out there had been a lake house the whole time. That single fact did more damage to Patricia's standing in the family than my microphone ever could have. I hadn't destroyed her reputation. Her own paperwork had. Patricia tried twice to reach out to me directly. The first time, she sent a text saying I had embarrassed the family in front of everyone, and that I could have handled it privately. I didn't respond to that one. The second time, she called Daniel, not me, and told him I had ruined her relationship with her own family, and asked him to get his wife to apologize publicly. Daniel, for the first time in our relationship, told his mother no. He told her that the only reason her relationship with her own family was damaged was the years of decisions that led to that moment, and that a wedding toast hadn't created any of it, it had just stopped hiding it. That was the moment I knew we were going to be okay, Daniel and me, because he didn't need me to explain the documents to him twice. He looked at them himself, quietly, on his own, and he came to his own conclusion. We set new boundaries after that, the kind that don't get undone by a nice phone call or a holiday invitation. Patricia no longer has a key to any place we live. She is not on any account, any lease, any joint, anything. When she visits, and she does occasionally, it's on our schedule, in our space, with our rules about what does and doesn't get discussed. My parents come for dinner every other Sunday, and they sit wherever they want. At a table nobody is going to rearrange for them, because there's no one left in the room trying to rearrange it. My mother asked me a few weeks after the wedding, sitting at our small kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, whether I regretted saying anything that night. I told her the truth. I regretted, for exactly as long as it took. Patricia's face to go pale that it had to happen at all. And then the regret passed, because I looked over at my mother, sitting in the seat I had chosen for her, not the one she'd been assigned by someone who thought she didn't belong up front, and I knew I would do it again in a heartbeat. My father doesn't talk about it much, which is very like him, but a few months later, at a family barbecue, when my uncle jokingly asked if he was going to cover the cost of something small, a bag of ice, nothing serious, my father laughed and said, "Not this time," and nobody pushed back. It was such a small moment, almost nothing, but I noticed it, because it was the first time in my entire life I had seen my father say no to a family financial joke without an apology trailing behind it. Daniel and I went to a few sessions with a family therapist afterward, not because our marriage was in trouble, but because he needed somewhere to process what it meant to grow up believing his mother's version of generosity was normal. He told me once, sitting in the therapist's small office with afternoon light coming through the blinds, that the hardest part wasn't finding out about the money. It was realizing how many times he'd watched his mother do something unfair and simply assumed that was what strong families looked like. I told him I understood that better than he probably realized because I'd spent my whole life assuming quiet families were the healthy ones. The extended Whitfield family didn't fully recover the way it looked from the outside. Some cousins still speak to Patricia. Some don't. The aunt who found out about the medical bills eventually got a small settlement from Patricia directly, privately, after a very tense phone call none of us were part of. Harold, for his part, never asked for anything back from the family. He told me once at a small gathering months later that the only thing he wanted was to stop being the only person who remembered what actually happened. I think, in a strange way, that's exactly what evidence does. It lets more than one person remember the truth at the same time. I think about that folding table by the kitchen doors sometimes, the one my mother sat at for 15 minutes before I found out. I think about her hands shaking as she buttoned my dress that morning, asking me not to cause trouble. I think about being 11 years old, watching $200 leave a cash register for someone else's bike. Here's what I've come to understand about the difference between revenge and self-respect, because I know some people watching this will call what I did revenge, and I want to be honest about why I don't think it was. Revenge would have been finding a way to hurt Patricia specifically, to make her suffer for the sake of watching her suffer. What I actually did was refuse to let a lie stand uncorrected in a room full of people who deserved the truth, and refuse to let my parents absorb a cost that was never theirs to absorb. I didn't create the consequences Patricia faced. She created them over years with her own hands and her own ledgers. I only stopped protecting her from them. There's a difference between standing up for yourself and trying to burn something down, and I think that difference comes down to one question. Are you adding harm, or are you just refusing to keep hiding it? I wasn't the one who moved money out of a payroll account. I wasn't the one who forged a signature on a seating chart. I wasn't the one who told a room full of guests that some families give what's needed while looking directly at the people who had given everything they promised. I just stopped being quiet about it. So here's my question for you, and I actually want you to answer it in the comments, because I read every single one. Have you ever had a moment in your own life where you had to choose between keeping the peace and finally telling the truth? What did you choose, and would you choose differently now? If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had someone try to take over a moment that was supposed to be yours, do me a favor and hit like, and if you haven't already, subscribe. Because there are more stories like this one coming, and I want you here when they do. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight, and what part of this story stuck with you the most. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. Names, characters, and incidents are the product of imagination and are used fictitiously.